Fade in. This is the introduction, so we will need the introduction music, which is the drum you've done with flutes, and then at the end I want it to finish on two notes like the last post, which is dun dun, and then fade out, and then I'll start talking and doing the introduction of the podcast. The Anglo-Boer Wars will introduce you to one of the bloodiest wars of the Victorian era, pitting the British Empire of over 500,000 men against just 50,000 of the Boer republics. The Anglo-Boer Wars were fought between 1880 and 1881 to 1899 to 1902. The two Boer republics, the Orange Free State and the Transvaal, against the might of the Empire of the British. Go back, I'm going to start that again. So, the war was fought, the two wars were fought between the two Boer republics of South Africa, the Orange Free State and the Transvaal, against the British Empire and her dominions. This podcast will discuss the political backdrop to the war, a history of the country, and the key figures that shape. This podcast will discuss the political backdrop of the war, a history of the country, and the key figures that shape the conflict. You'll recognise names such as Churchill, Kruger, Rhodes, and Kitchener. They had major influences on this war. You'll also recognise familiar characters such as Gandhi, Baden-Powell, Kipling and Conan Doyle. Learn what impacts these people had, what they said and how they shaped the war. Then we need some sort of firing, cannon or musket sound effect, and then we're going to go back, play a shortened version of the introduction. So we'll have a longer introduction at the start, and then that same introduction again, but now I'm going to go back and do the full full podcast now. Okay, introduction again is faded out, and we're back in. Between 1835 and 1845, 15,000 people of Dutch extract moved from the Cape Colony into the interior, what is now known as South Africa. This was called a Great Trek. It was a direct result of Britain's insistence of equalisation policy between the blacks and whites in the Cape Colony. Emancipated slaves had a devastating effect on the economy, heavily reliant on free slave labour to work the land. Legislation was passed in 1835. Legislation was passed in 1834, which guaranteed equal treatment under the law regardless of race. When slavery was abolished in 1834, the Boers, who relied heavily on free slave labour to farm their land, opposed the law. Further friction occurred when the Boers believed they were not being compensated sufficiently for their emancipated slaves. Hostilities started to brew in 1833 when English was adopted as the official language of the Outlander population, which were mostly English settlers. Hostilities started to brew in 1833. English was adopted as the official language of the Uitlander, which is Outlander population. English settlers saw their political influence grow. Two independent republics were established within the interior of South Africa, which was the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. which were recognised by Great Britain at the Sand River and Bloemfontein Conventions in 1852 and 1854 respectively, although the British still claimed sovereignty all over South Africa. The Boers saw gradual state administration emerge from near subsistence economy. The Boers saw gradual state administration emerge from a near subsistence economy. Enough food was produced to feed the farmer and his family. Imperial ambitions were already evident within the region with the annexation of Botswana. Imperial ambitions were already evident within the region with the annexation of Basutoland in 1868. Lord Carnarvon, which was the colonial secretary at the time, suggested a confederation of states within South Africa. Lord Carnarvon, which was the colonial secretary at the time, suggested a confederation of states within South Africa. A similar confederation that Canada was ruled by in 1867, which aimed at creating a more stable region and greater economic integration under British rule. In 1877, Great Britain peacefully annexed a near bankrupt Transvaal. The Transvaal Boers petitioned London for independence, led by Paul Kruger. Once independence was refused, the Transvaal government on 16th of December 1880 declared themselves a republic. The Orange Free State remained neutral throughout the First Boer War. The Boers had no regular standing units within So I'm going on to the next chapter. So this is where we'll have another sound effect. Again, it could be cannon, musket, Boers. I quite like the some sort of recording where somebody screams fire and then there's a cannon or musket fire. Just something loud to break up the speaking. The Boers had no standing units and were an amateur army. Each man wore his everyday clothes, which blended well into the terrain. Each district would form a military unit called a commando. Each Berger would bring their own horse and weapon, which was usually a hunting rifle. They also elected their own officers. A staggering 30,000 to 40,000 men could be mustered within a week. The commandos were an expert mobile force. They used modern Mauser. The commandos were an expert mobile force. They used modern Mauser rifles that were smokeless. This wouldn't betray their positions once fired. Each Berger was a crack shot. As a nation, the Boer farmers spent most of their time in the saddle. Law within the Boer nation demanded that each male between the ages of 16 to 60 would serve mandatory commando service in times of need. The commando unit would form the majority of the Boer forces in both Boer Wars. Each unit would be attached to a town, with each town divided into districts, then wards. Each commando would be commanded by a commandant, with a ward led by a field cornet, which would be equivalent rank to an NCO. The field cornets were also responsible for policy. Each field cornet would be responsible for policing this ward. collecting taxes, and issuing firearms in time of need. Issuing firearms in times of war. The commando was made up of volunteers, with all officers appointed by members of the commando and not by the government. This policy had both advantages and disadvantages. Commanders such as General Cruz de la Rey and General C.R. DeWitt would prove to be exceptional leaders, men who would not necessarily have been chosen to lead by government appointment. Some less successful commanders were elected by commandos just on the back of local popularity at the time. Discipline would also become a problem, as there was no real way to enforce it. Each burgher would be responsible for keeping his weapons serviceable and ready at all time. At the outbreak of the war, the Transvaal government would issue the commandos with modern clip-loading Mauser rifles. At the outbreak of the war, the Transvaal government issued the commandos with modern clip-loading Mauser weapons. The build-up to the war saw the Boer republics acquire Krupp and Creuset artillery pieces purchased in readiness. Weapons used in this conflict can be seen today in modern warfare: automatic handguns, machine guns, and magazine-fed rifles. The rifles the Boers used gave a greater advantage over the rifles used by the British Army. Greater accuracy could be achieved over longer distances. The British fielded the Lee Enfield and Lee Metford rifles, with the Boer rifles superior. The Mauser firing a heavier bullet at a faster pace meant more likely severity of weapons. The Mauser fired a heavier bullet at a faster pace, which meant that there would be more severity. Heavier wounds were inflicted as the Mauser fired a heavier bullet at a faster pace. The Mausers also had greater sights, so there was the potential to fire more accurately over a long distance. The British officers also had a tendency to order fixed bayonets while engaging the enemy, which also had the tendency. So go back to the longer distance. So after the longer distance, British officers also had a tendency to order fixed bayonets and charge while engaging the enemy. This had a detrimental effect on firing accuracy. No, wrong. Go back. British officers also ordered fixed bayonets. This had a detrimental effect on firing, as it added an extra 15 pounds of weight at the end of the rifle, which would make it harder to hit their target. This war would also see the last use of the lance, a 14th century invention used from horseback. The lance was an extremely powerful weapon in a cavalry charge, but would not see major action on such a scale since. Tactics used at the start of the Tactics used at the start of the war from a British point of view was a holding action. The Boers struck quick to cut off enemy. Tactics used at the start of the war from a British point of view was a holding action. The Boers would quickly strike and cut off lines of resupply. Ports were also target, so the British would find it harder to reinforce units within the interior of the South African continent. Ports were also targeted, so the British would find it harder to reinforce units in the interior of South Africa. Boer tactics were quick cut and thrust and highly mobile commando units. Go back. Ball tack